The forest was still that evening, blanketed in a deep, unsettling quiet. My best friend Matt and I had planned this hiking trip for weeks. It was supposed to be an escape from the grind, a chance to breathe in the crisp air and feel the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that we weren't alone. The trail was unmarked, weaving through towering pines and dense undergrowth. A local had mentioned the forest's reputation for strange occurrences, but we'd dismissed it as campfire folklore. We were skeptics, grounded in reality, or so we thought. As twilight deepened, the forest transformed. The once beautiful golden light turned into ominous shadows that stretched and danced unnaturally. "We should set up camp soon," Matt suggested, his voice carrying a nervous edge. I nodded, and we found a clearing near a small brook. The sound of running water was soothing, masking the oppressive silence that seemed to close in around us. While we pitched the tent, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted between the trees, too quick and deliberate to be an animal. "Did you see that?" I asked Matt, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" he replied, glancing up from the stakes. I thought I saw something," I stammered, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. Matt shrugged it off, but the unease lingered. That night the fire crackled, its warmth barely penetrating the chill that had settled over the clearing. We talked about everything and nothing, trying to distract ourselves from the creeping sense of dread. Then we heard it, a low rustling sound like dry leaves being dragged across the forest floor. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer. Matt grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered, but his grip on the flashlight was tight. The beam of light swept across the forest, illuminating nothing but twisted branches and shadows. Yet I felt it, a presence cold and menacing, just beyond the reach of the light. We decided to retreat to the tent, zipping ourselves inside like children hiding from monsters. But the sound didn't stop. It circled the tent, a deliberate shuffling noise that made my skin crawl. "Stay calm," Matt whispered, though his voice betrayed his fear. Then the shadow appeared. Through the thin fabric of the tent, we saw it, a tall, hunched figure darker than the night itself. It stood still, watching, waiting. My breath hitched as the air grew heavy, suffocating. Matt clutched my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, a silent, oppressive force. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The next morning, the forest was bathed in sunlight, the terror of the night seemingly washed away. Matt and I exchanged uneasy glances but said little. We packed up camp, eager to leave the clearing behind. But as we resumed our hike, the feeling of being watched returned. It wasn't long before we found the first marker, a crude symbol carved into the bark of a tree. It was a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun drawn by a child. "Did you do this?" Matt asked, his voice tight. "Of course not," I replied. More symbols appeared as we continued, each one more elaborate, more unsettling. They weren't random. They were a path, guiding us deeper into the forest. "We should turn back," Matt said. But when we tried, the trails seemed to twist and shift, leading us back to the symbols no matter which direction we chose. The forest had become a maze, trapping us in its cold, unrelenting grasp. As night fell again, the shadow returned. This time it didn't linger at the edges. It moved closer, darting between trees, always just out of reach. The fire offered no comfort. Its light seemed to shrink, as if consumed by the encroaching darkness. "Stay together," Matt said, his voice trembling. We stood back to back, clutching makeshift weapons, a branch for him, a rock for me. The shadow circled us, faster and faster, its form twisting and elongating. And then it spoke. Its voice was a whisper, 1,000 voices layered atop one another. "Why do you trespass?" it asked, each word dripping with malice. "We didn't mean to," I stammered. "We'll leave. Just let us go." The shadow laughed, a sound that made my blood run cold. "You are already mine." The fire extinguished, plunging us into darkness. The shadow surged forward, engulfing us in a suffocating, icy void. I screamed, swinging the rock wildly, but it passed through the shadow as though it were smoke. Matt shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. When I woke, the forest was silent. The sunlight was blinding, and the clearing was empty. Matt was gone. I searched for hours, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. All I found were more symbols, carved into the trees, each one more frantic and chaotic than the last. Finally, I stumbled upon his backpack, torn and discarded near a massive tree with roots that seemed to pulse like veins. A single word was carved into the bark. Stay. I ran, the forest seeming to stretch endlessly before me. When I finally burst into the open, collapsing onto a dirt road, the world felt foreign, distant. A passing driver stopped to help, but I couldn't explain what had happened. How could I? I never found Matt. Search parties scoured the forest for weeks, but they found no trace of him. The locals warned me never to return, whispering about the forest's curse and the shadows that claimed those who ventured too far. Even now, years later, I feel its presence. In the corner of my eye and the flicker of a shadow on the wall, I see it, watching, waiting, and I know it will come for me one day. The forest swallowed us whole. Miles of trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. My boyfriend Liam and I had planned this trip as a weekend escape, a chance to reconnect away from the chaos of the city. But as dusk crept in, the beauty of the woods turned sinister. We were lost. I swear this was the right path, Liam muttered, his voice tight with frustration. The GPS on his phone had stopped working hours ago, and the trail markers had long since disappeared. Now, with darkness descending and the temperature dropping, every rustling leaf felt like a threat. We need shelter, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We can't keep walking in the dark. That's when we saw it. A sliver of shadow through the trees, angular and unnatural. As we drew closer, it materialized. A cabin, weathered and ancient, standing defiantly against the encroaching forest. Its windows were dark, its wooden walls warped with age. This wasn't on the map, Liam said uneasily. Do you have a better idea? I snapped. He didn't. We approached cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot deafening in the stillness. The air around the cabin felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. I don't like this, Liam said, his eyes darting nervously. It feels wrong. It's just an old cabin, I said, though my own unease gnawed at me. We'll stay until morning. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The single room was sparsely furnished. A rickety table, a few mismatched chairs, and a bed in the corner covered in a tattered quilt. A fireplace sat cold and empty, its stone mantel coated in dust. I'll get some firewood, Liam said, eager for any excuse to leave the oppressive cabin. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, leaving me alone. The silence was deafening. I tried to distract myself by unpacking our bags, but my every movement felt amplified, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a scream. That's when I noticed it. The smell. Faint at first, like spoiled meat, but growing stronger by the second. My stomach turned as I followed the scent to a trapdoor in the corner of the room. The wooden latch was rusted, and the edges of the door were stained a dark, sticky brown. My instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but curiosity clawed at me. I reached for the latch. Before I could lift the door, Liam burst back inside, his face pale. We need to leave, he said, his voice trembling. What? Why? I asked, startled by the panic in his eyes. There's something out there, he said, slamming the door behind him. I heard it. Something big. It was circling the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean, something? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. But it wasn't an animal. Not a normal one. We barricaded the door with a chair and huddled near the cold fireplace, the flashlight casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest had gone deathly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin with an unnatural rhythm. Liam's grip on my hand tightened as the sound moved closer, stopping just outside the door. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared at the shadow that slid beneath the crack in the door. Tall, thin, and impossibly distorted. And then it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The sound reverberated through the cabin, each knock heavier than the last. "Who's there?" Liam called, his voice cracking. No answer, just silence. And then, laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong. It seeped through the cracks in the door, curling around us like smoke. I felt it in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Stay back," Liam said, grabbing a broken chair leg like a weapon. But before he could move, the laughter stopped, replaced by a deafening crash. Something heavy had slammed against the door, shaking the entire cabin. We scrambled to the far side of the room, the flashlight trembling in Liam's hand. The trapdoor in the corner rattled, as if something beneath it had been woken by the commotion. My stomach churned as the scent of rot intensified, filling the cabin with its sickly sweetness. And then we heard it, a faint whisper, coming from beneath the floorboards. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent, until the words were clear. "Let me out." Liam and I froze, staring at the trapdoor. "This isn't happening," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be real." The banging at the door grew more violent, splintering the wood. Whatever was outside was trying to get in, and whatever was beneath us was trying to get out. "We have to open it," I said, my voice barely audible. "Are you insane?" Liam snapped. "We need to run, not—" Before he could finish, the door gave way with a deafening crack. The shadow poured into the cabin, its form shifting and writhing like smoke given life. It had no face, only a gaping void where its features should have been. The room grew cold, frost spreading across the walls as it moved toward us. In a desperate bid for escape, Liam yanked open the trapdoor. Below was a narrow tunnel, its walls slick with something dark and glistening. "Go!" he shouted, shoving me toward the opening. We scrambled into the tunnel, the flashlight barely illuminating the way ahead. The air was thick and wet, and the walls seemed to pulse as if alive. Behind us, the shadow followed, its form seeping into the tunnel like black ink. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing off the walls. "You can't escape," they taunted, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "You're ours." The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the earth. My legs burned and my lungs felt ready to burst, but I didn't dare stop. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a flickering, unnatural glow. We emerged into a cavern, its walls covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen carved into the trees. In the center stood an altar, and on it, something alive. It writhed and pulsed, a mass of flesh and shadows that defied comprehension. The whispers grew deafening, emanating from the thing on the altar. Liam grabbed my hand, pulling me toward another tunnel on the far side of the cavern. But as we ran, the shadow caught up, its tendrils wrapping around Liam's ankle. He screamed, kicking desperately, but it was no use. The shadow dragged him toward the altar, his cries echoing in the cavern. I tried to hold on to him, but the force was too strong. "Run!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Just go." I hesitated, tears streaming down my face before forcing myself to turn and run. The last thing I heard was Liam's scream, cut off abruptly as the cavern collapsed behind me. I don't remember how I found my way out of the forest. When I stumbled onto the road, a passing driver stopped to help, but I couldn't explain what had happened. All I could do was point back toward the woods, toward the place where I'd lost everything. The cabin was never found. No one believed my story, but I know the truth. Something was in that cabin, and it's still out there, waiting. The trail was supposed to be breathtaking. Winding through the heart of the Grey Rock Mountains, it promised stunning views, untouched wilderness, and the thrill of adventure. For me and my 3 closest friends, Lucas, Sarah, and Emily, it was a chance to escape our suffocating city lives and reconnect with nature. The brochures had painted it as an unforgettable journey, but they had left out the warning. Once you set foot on that trail, it wouldn't let you leave. We started early, the morning air crisp and invigorating. The trailhead greeted us with a wooden sign, its letters carved deep. Crescent Ridge, 12 miles to summit. Beneath it, scratched hastily into the wood, were the words, "Turn back." We laughed nervously at the graffiti, dismissing it as the work of a bored teenager. The first few hours passed without incident. The dense forest canopy let in just enough sunlight to guide our way, and we marveled at the sheer beauty of the surroundings. Lucas led the group, armed with a map and compass, while Sarah snapped pictures of everything in sight. Emily and I trailed behind, talking quietly, the crunch of leaves underfoot our only soundtrack. But as we climbed higher, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, heavier, and the cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by an oppressive silence. It was subtle at first, a missing sound here, a faint unease there. By the time we reached the first clearing, the unease had become undeniable. The clearing was wrong. The trees around its edges leaned inward unnaturally, their twisted branches forming a jagged canopy overhead. In the center stood a wooden marker, weathered and splintered. Lucas approached it cautiously, brushing away the moss that clung to its surface. "Do not look back." We stared at the words, their stark simplicity filling us with an inexplicable dread. "This is some kind of joke," Lucas said, forcing a laugh. "Right? Probably just some creepy trail lore," Sarah added, though her voice trembled. Emily and I exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. We pressed on, but the trail seemed to grow darker with every step. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The path twisted and narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The air carried a faint metallic tang like the scent of blood. And then came the sound, a low rhythmic tapping, faint but persistent. "What is that?" Emily whispered, clutching my arm. Lucas turned, his face pale. "It's probably just a bird or something." But even he didn't sound convinced. As the day wore on, the tapping grew louder, closer. It seemed to echo around us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We quickened our pace, but the trail seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it should have. The sun, which had been high in the sky when we started, now hovered stubbornly at the horizon, casting the forest in an eerie orange glow. Then we saw it. A figure stood ahead, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, and motionless. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were listening. "Do you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Lucas replied, his voice tight. "Stay calm. Let's just keep moving." We edged forward, hearts pounding, but the figure didn't move. As we drew closer, its details became clearer. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over angular bones. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth was frozen in a grotesque grin. Emily screamed, and the figure twitched. With a sharp, jerking motion, it turned and disappeared into the forest. But the tapping remained. We ran. Abandoning all sense of direction, we sprinted down the trail, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. But no matter how far we ran, the tapping followed. Faster now, more erratic, like a predator closing in. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we realized we were back at the clearing. The same twisted trees, the same ominous marker. "Do not look back." "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't turn back. How are we back here?" "We need to keep going," Lucas said, though his voice was laced with panic. "We'll find the summit. There has to be another way." But there wasn't. The trail had changed. The path we'd followed so confidently that morning now spiraled outward, fracturing into countless smaller trails, each vanishing into the encroaching darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the tapping grew louder. We chose a path at random, sticking close together as the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees no longer looked natural. Their trunks were split and blackened, and their branches reached down like skeletal arms. The ground beneath us felt soft and spongy, and the air carried a putrid stench. Emily stumbled, crying out as she fell to her knees. "I can't," she began, but her words were cut off by a sharp crack. The ground beneath her collapsed, revealing a gaping hole filled with writhing roots. They coiled around her legs, dragging her downward as she screamed. We grabbed her arms, pulling with all our strength, but the roots were relentless. They wrapped around her torso, her neck, until she was gone. The earth sealed itself, leaving no trace of her. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, clawing at the ground. But there was nothing we could do. We pressed on, fear driving us forward. The tapping had become deafening now, a chaotic rhythm that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. And then, ahead of us, the trail ended. A cliff edge loomed before us, its jagged rocks plunging into an abyss shrouded in mist. Standing at the edge was the figure. It turned slowly, its hollow eyes fixed on us. Lucas stepped forward, trembling but defiant. "What do you want?" he shouted. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it raised a long, bony arm and pointed at Sarah. She froze, her face pale as a ghost. "No," she whispered, backing away. But her feet betrayed her, carrying her forward as though pulled by an invisible force. "Sarah, stop!" I yelled, grabbing her arm. But it was too late. She stepped off the edge, her body vanishing into the mist below. The figure grinned, its empty sockets burning into mine. Lucas and I didn't speak as we ran. We didn't even look at each other, afraid of what we might see. The forest had consumed us, its twisted paths leading us in circles, its shadows mocking our desperation. Finally, we collapsed in exhaustion, the tapping mercifully distant for the first time in hours. But the relief was short-lived. The trees around us began to move, their trunks twisting and groaning as they bent toward us. The tapping returned, louder and faster, and with it came the figure. It stepped out of the shadows, its movements jerky and unnatural. This time, there was no escape. It raised its arms, and the forest itself seemed to respond, the branches reaching down to ensnare us. As the darkness closed in, Lucas screamed. I tried to fight, but the shadow was too strong, its cold grip pulling me into the void. When I woke, I was back at the trailhead. The wooden sign stood before me. The words "turn back" now etched deep into my memory. Lucas, Sarah, and Emily were gone. I stumbled back to civilization, my story dismissed as hysteria. But I know the truth. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Not a single bird chirped, no rustle of leaves, no sound of distant animals moving through the underbrush. The only noise came from our crunching footsteps on the trail, an intrusive reminder that we were alone out here. Or so we thought. I was hiking with my brother Ethan and our friend Mia, the three of us eager to explore the dense, uncharted expanse of the Pine Hollow National Forest. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, but by the time we reached the trailhead, the sky had already turned gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the trees. The air was damp, thick with the earthy smell of moss and wet wood. "I swear this trail was marked better last time," Ethan muttered, squinting at the worn map in his hands. Mia rolled her eyes. "It's fine. We've got GPS if we get lost. Let's just enjoy it." But the forest had other plans. The first strange sign came within the hour. As we moved deeper into the woods, I noticed the trees. Their trunks were scored with deep gashes, like claw marks, each one spaced evenly as though something deliberate had made them. "Do bears claw trees this high?" I asked, pointing to the marks etched far above our heads. Ethan glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Not this high. Maybe it's just an old tree disease?" Mia leaned closer, running her fingers lightly over the grooves. "It doesn't look natural. It's too perfect." Her words lingered in the air as we pressed on, unease settling over us like a cold fog. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, the forest swallowing even the sound of our voices. The path seemed to narrow, the trees bending toward us as though they were listening. And then it started. The snapping of a twig. We all froze, spinning toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, gripping the map tightly. "It's probably just a deer. Let's keep moving." But it didn't feel like a deer. The air had shifted, charged with an oppressive weight that made my skin prickle. We walked faster, our once leisurely pace now a hurried march, but the feeling only grew stronger. Something was following us. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we reached a small clearing. Ethan suggested we set up camp, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every time I turned my head, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Dark shapes flitting between the trees, there one moment and gone the next. Mia noticed it too. "There's something out there," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw it. It was tall." Ethan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "You're both just spooked. These woods play tricks on your eyes. Let's get the fire going." The fire crackled weakly, its flickering light barely penetrating the dense darkness surrounding us. The night was suffocating, the kind of blackness that makes you question if you're awake or dreaming. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl emanating from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze us in place. "What the hell was that?" Ethan whispered, his bravado evaporating. No one answered. Mia clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, its weak beam barely slicing through the thick wall of trees. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. "Who's there?" The only response was silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel alone. It was the silence of something holding its breath, watching, waiting. Sleep was impossible. We huddled together by the dying fire, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The footsteps came and went, always just far enough to keep us guessing. Once I thought I saw eyes, two glowing pinpoints in the dark, staring directly at me. But when I blinked, they were gone. By dawn, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice firm despite the fear etched across her face. "Whatever's out there, it's not going to let us stay." Ethan didn't argue. We packed up quickly, leaving behind the fire pit and the scraps of our restless night. But the forest didn't let us go so easily. The trail was different. The path we'd followed so carefully the day before had changed, twisting and splitting into unfamiliar directions. The trees looked the same, gnarled and ancient, their bark covered in the same claw marks. But they seemed closer now, as if they had moved in the night. "We came this way," Ethan insisted, holding the map uselessly in his hands. But it was no use. The forest had swallowed the trail. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shape, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. Its body seemed to ripple, like shadows given form. But as we stared, it moved. Not walking, but gliding, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Run," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. We bolted, our footsteps thundering through the underbrush. The thing didn't follow. Not at first. But we could hear it, the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching as it kept pace with us, never falling too far behind. "Faster!" Ethan shouted, his voice raw with panic. We burst into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive dead tree. Its branches were twisted, reaching out like skeletal fingers, and beneath it, etched into the dirt, were words. "You cannot leave." The air grew colder as the footsteps closed in, slower now, deliberate. The thing emerged from the shadows, its face, or what should have been a face, smooth and featureless. It tilted its head, as if studying us, before taking a single step forward. Mia screamed, clutching a branch from the ground and swinging it wildly. It passed through the creature as though it were smoke, and the thing didn't flinch. "We're trapped," Ethan whispered, his voice hollow. "It's not going to let us leave." The creature moved closer, its body distorting with each step, until it towered over us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Its presence filled the clearing, suffocating and absolute. Then, it spoke, not with words but with a sound, low and guttural, reverberating in my chest. It didn't need words. Its message was clear. "You belong to the forest now." I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was staring into the void where its face should have been, and the next, I was running, the forest blurring around me. I didn't stop until I stumbled onto the trailhead, collapsing onto the gravel road. Ethan and Mia never made it out. No one believes me when I tell them what happened in the woods. The official report says they got lost, that the forest claimed them like it had so many others. But I know the truth. The forest isn't just alive, it's watching, and it doesn't let go. The old mining town of Ravens Hollow wasn't on any modern map, and that's precisely why we chose it. The stories surrounding it were vague, something about abandoned mines, a toxic collapse, and a town forgotten by time. But for me, Sarah, my boyfriend Josh, and his brother Eric, it was the perfect spot for an adventure. A spooky weekend in a desolate ghost town sounded harmless. We thought we could handle whatever we found there. We were wrong. The first sign was the road, or rather, the lack of one. Our GPS gave up miles before we arrived, and the dirt path we followed was barely passable. Thick trees leaned over us, blotting out the sunlight and casting strange shadows. By the time we reached the town's outskirts, the air was heavy with silence, the kind that wasn't just quiet but expectant. Ravens Hollow was exactly what we hoped for, eerie and untouched. Rusted mining carts lay overturned near collapsed shacks. We found a well at the center of town, its wooden cover rotted and caving in. The church at the far end of the main street leaned at a precarious angle, its bell long gone. "This is awesome," Eric said, pulling out his camera. "Like a scene straight out of a horror movie." Josh grinned. "And we're the dumb teenagers who don't listen to the warnings." "Exactly," Eric laughed, and they high-fived. I didn't laugh. Something about the place felt off, like the air carried a weight you could feel in your bones. But I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't want to be the buzzkill. We set up camp in the middle of town, near the remnants of what must have been a general store. While the guys joked and explored, I wandered to a crumbling notice board nailed to the side of the store. Faded posters flapped in the light breeze, their edges torn and discolored. Most were illegible, but one caught my eye. "Stay out. Do not enter the mines." The letters were bold, underlined in red paint. Below them was a warning scratched into the wood. "It's awake. Leave now." A chill crawled down my spine. "Hey guys," I called. "Look at this." Josh sauntered over, reading the message aloud. "It's awake? What's awake?" "Probably someone's idea of a joke," Eric said, snapping a picture of the board. "Small towns love their urban legends." Josh nodded, putting an arm around my shoulders. "Relax, Sarah. We're here for fun, remember?" I didn't press the issue, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. That night, the wind howled through the town, rattling our tent and whistling through the cracks in the old buildings. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something faint, scraping, almost like nails on stone. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. At some point, Eric shook me awake. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Sarah, wake up. Josh is gone." "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, sitting up too fast and banging my head against the tent's roof. "I woke up and he wasn't in his sleeping bag," Eric said, his voice trembling. "I thought maybe he went to, but he's been gone too long." We grabbed our flashlights and stumbled into the cold night air. The town looked even more haunting under the moonlight, the shadows deep and endless. "Josh!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty buildings. Then we saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance, near the entrance to one of the mines. "No way," Eric whispered. "He wouldn't, but he would." Josh loved pushing limits, proving he wasn't scared. He probably thought it'd be hilarious to explore the mine and jump out at us later. I wasn't laughing. The mine entrance was a yawning black hole, its wooden beams sagging under decades of decay. Rusted chains dangled from posts, and an ancient sign lay half buried in the dirt. The remaining letters read, "Danger, do not enter." Eric hesitated. "We shouldn't go in." "And leave Josh in there?" I snapped, fear making my voice sharper than I intended. "Come on." We stepped inside, the darkness swallowing us whole. Our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, their weak beams illuminating walls streaked with black and red stains. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the smell of rot. "Josh!" I called, my voice bouncing back at me in distorted echoes. No response. We moved deeper, the tunnel narrowing around us. The faint light we'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed alive, pressing against us from all sides. The scratching sound I'd heard earlier was louder now, accompanied by faint whispers that didn't belong to either of us. "Do you hear that?" Eric asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The whispers seemed to grow louder, forming words that I couldn't quite understand. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then we saw it. Josh was standing in the center of a cavern, his back to us. His flashlight lay discarded on the ground, its beam illuminating the far wall. Carved into the rock were symbols, circles, jagged lines, and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. They seemed to pulse, as though alive. "Josh?" I said, stepping forward. He didn't move. "Josh, this isn't funny," Eric said, his voice breaking. He reached out to touch his brother's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Josh turned, and I screamed. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that oozed black ichor. His face was twisted into a grin so wide it looked like it might tear his skin. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Eric stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. "Josh, what?" Before we could react, the walls of the cavern seemed to come alive. Shadows poured from the cracks, writhing and twisting like living smoke. The whispers turned into guttural growls, filling the space with a deafening roar. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Eric's arm. We bolted, the shadows chasing us through the narrow tunnels. The air grew colder, the growls louder, and I could feel something brushing against my back, fingers, claws. I didn't know. I didn't dare look back. We burst out of the mine, collapsing onto the dirt outside. The night was still and silent again. The forest surrounding the town bathed in pale moonlight. But Josh was gone. Eric stared at the mine entrance, his face pale and tear-streaked. We can't leave him." I grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at me. That wasn't Josh, whatever that was. It wasn't him anymore. His shoulders sagged and he nodded, tears streaming down his face. We didn't speak as we packed up our gear, the oppressive silence of Raven's Hollow weighing on us like a curse. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never told anyone what happened in Raven's Hollow. But every night since, I've dreamed of that mine, of the shadows and the whispers. Sometimes I think I hear them even when I'm awake. And I know it's not over. We ignored the warning signs and it cost us. One day, it will come for me too. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next terrifying journey. Got your own scary experience or story idea? Share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay curious and stay safe.